Hello, this is Mat Ricardo, the co-host along with Bill Barol of Imagination and Junk. Hope you enjoy this episode from the first season of our transatlantic conversation about the hard work of creativity. And if you do, then make sure you subscribe at imaginationandjunk.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Season 2 is out now and Season 3 is coming soon. But for now, enjoy the episode.
I'm Bill Barol. Over the last few decades, I've done every kind of writing there is to do, from journalism to humor, books, movies, and television.
I'm Mat Ricardo. For the last 30 years, I've toured the world as a variety performer.
Earlier this year, we came together across the Atlantic to talk about creativity, what it is, where it comes from, why it matters.
Thomas Edison said, "To invent, you need a good imagination and a pile of junk."
This is Imagination and Junk, a conversation about the hard work of creativity.
Episode 3, Gorilla Position.
Dear Matt, let's talk about style. There. You see what I did there? Direct, unambiguous. None of that, "Hey Matt, how are you? It's a nice day here. How is it where you are?" jibber jabber. Just a clean shot. Is that style? Gore Vidal said, "Style is knowing who you are and what you want to say, and not giving a damn." Now, Vidal was a professional blowhard. He was a guy who said stuff for a living. There were a lot of characters like that in the 60s and 70s. People who, whatever else they did, their main job seemed to be going on TV and saying vaguely epigrammatic things to Dick Cavett, which was nice work if you could get it. Anyway, that was Vidal, so I don't know if even he believed it. And I'm not sure I do either. It glibly skates past some of the more difficult questions about style. And they're ones that are worth considering, because style is the beautiful face we put on what we do. So let's talk about what goes into it. First things first. I think it's useful to separate style from technical proficiency, which we talked about in the last episode. I guess you could argue that style is something you develop along with technical facility. But by and large, I think it's a thing you attain after, once you have the basic moves down. It's what you do with what you know, something that flows out of you and animates what you create. And more than that, it's the thing that makes what you create uniquely yours, because it's the invisible, inevitable byproduct of things that lie beyond your craft, your personality, your outlook, your experience. All of the things that make you, you, make your work, and yours alone. Here's an example from my Newsweek days. Around 1987, the magazine's top editors, who were collectively known as the Wallendas, after the famous Highwire family, which should tell you everything you need to know about the self-regard of Newsweekly editors in those days. The Wallendas were looking for ways to crack the house style open and blow some fresh air through it. I was one of the principal beneficiaries of that move because I had an odd catch-all portfolio in the magazine's feature section, what was called the back of the book. Obscure pop culture stories, rock and roll, entertainment, lowbrow trends. And I guess the thinking was that nobody bought Newsweek to read about those things, so the editors could safely try out some new stuff there, under the radar. So the timing was right in the late summer of that year for me to go to my editor and pitch what was, for that place and time, an extraordinarily eccentric idea. That I fly to Las Vegas for the annual Labor Day telethon of the Muscular Dystrophy Association, a truly gonzo TV ritual hosted annually by the comedian Jerry Lewis.
Jerry Lewis!
And that I sit in the audience with a laptop and write, in real time, a telethon diary. The key to it was that Lewis famously didn't sleep during the broadcast's 21 and a half hours. So, neither would I. As he descended into a kind of sleep-deprived insanity, so would I. And I'd be writing the whole time. Inexplicably, my editor said yes. I got outfitted with the state-of-the-art in portable computers at the time, a Radio Shack TRS-80 Model 100 that weighed about as much as a Volkswagen and wasn't much smaller. And off I went to Vegas. What I came back with was, and I'm proud to say this, almost certainly the weirdest thing to ever appear in the pages of a newsweekly. In it, I fantasized about a performing troupe of acrobatic Newfoundlands. I compared the hairdo of 1960s lounge singer Jerry Vale to meringue, and obliquely compared another singer, Lola Falana, to a mob boss. In the morning, after a long, long night, I mused sleepily about punching other audience members in the face. It's all still there. You can read it if you care to. There's a link in the show notes. What does this have to do with style? Just this. By 1987, I'd nailed Newsweek's house style. I could write straight down the middle in that magisterial I'm nobody from nowhere voice, on trends, on pop music, on show business, and occasionally, when I'd get borrowed into the hallowed precincts of the front of the book, because I was a reliable professional who could be plugged into any kind of a story, on national affairs or on business. But the telethon piece, which I never would have gotten the okay for if I hadn't mastered the technical requirements to write stuff much less outlandish, that was something much purer. It was me, in Newsweek, but with the Newsweek gloves taken off. And maybe because it was written in real time and only lightly edited, almost entirely for space, it was a truer reflection of my real sensibility than anything else I ever wrote there. It had it all: my taste for a cheap wisecrack, my affection for the rituals of old-time show business, my crankiness, especially when sleepy. Was it the most successful thing I ever wrote for Newsweek? I don't know. But out of a couple of hundred stories I wrote there, it was my favorite. And years later, it's one of the few individual stories people still remember and talk to me about. This is what style does. It doesn't remove you from the line of people who've done what you do, but it does give you a way to make your own claim on that line, the one nobody else can make, and, if you choose, to stand out from it. Maybe Vidal was right after all. Because in that moment, in the over-refrigerated air of a gigantic Las Vegas amphitheater, in the middle of the night, running on fumes, I didn't give a damn. Oh, one more thing. Don't get me wrong. I do enjoy the hey Matt, hey Bill jibber-jabber. I was just making a point. So I hope you're well over there and keeping busy. And as always, in this most bizarrely stressful of years, staying safe and making things. Take care. Bill.
Dear Bill, it's Sunday afternoon here, and I'm sitting in my comfy chair, staring out of the window at the feral Brexiteers snarling at each other as they hunt for cake scraps in the drizzle. At the time of writing this, the new UK variant of the coronavirus has hit your shores. It's literally the only thing my country has made and successfully exported in recent years, so we're all very proud. Could be worse, at least it's not another James Corden. You didn't do your usual intro, so I thought I'd double down with mine. I think you're right that style comes after a certain amount of technical competence. And I think the more you go down whatever creative path you're on, the more your style matters. And then perhaps the less technical excellence matters. It is, as legendary 80s British girl band Bananarama once put it, not what you do, it's the way that you do it. I loved Bananarama. I once watched a Laurel and Hardy movie on TV with one of them, but that's very much another story. My point is that certainly in my business, and I suspect in many others, if you can develop a personal style strong enough to let your audience really connect with you, then what you're actually doing becomes a little bit less important. If you work hard enough in your early days at your technical ability, then, with luck and hard work, you'll reach the point where you're confident with it, and you can start to relax and stretch and let a little of yourself start to grow into it, as you did with your telethon piece, which, by the way, sounds like an insane adventure. There's an analogy that I always go back to when I'm directing stuff or making something new, and it is, like almost all of my analogies, professional wrestling related. So imagine you go to a wrestling show and you get there midway through a match. You don't know who the people in the ring are, but they're doing some cool somersaults and flips and drop kicks and stuff, and then one of them wins, and yeah, it's fine. But if you're a fan, then not only do you know who the two wrestlers are, you know where they're from. You know their histories, their allegiances, their opinions, their reasons for fighting. You remember that perhaps they used to be friends, having trained together when they were young, but since then there have been betrayals, bad blood. They had become very different people, driven by different desires, one wanting to repair the relationship, the other only able to move on when they put their old friend in the hospital. They square off, one with grit teeth screaming for blood, the other with tears in their eyes, reticent to attack an old friend. And not one punch has been thrown, but you care. And you're on your feet, and you're not going to look away for a second. If you can make an audience care about you, then whatever you do instantly becomes so much more meaningful and compelling. That's always been my theory. Sometimes it's fun to make things look easy, but mostly I like to find ways to show my audiences how hard something is. To show them the struggle, to show them the fragility of the idiot on stage trying hard to impress them. Sometimes I use a line in my shows. The difference, I say, between a juggler and a magician is that if a magician gets a trick wrong, well, it's game over. Done. Finished. But with a juggler, if I drop, I can pick it up, I can try again, and the audience will love me all the more. At which point, of course, I fix them with puppy dog eyes, hoping that they'll agree. It's true though, and it's honest. It's my onstage persona being an extension of my genuine desire to get things right, to impress, to be loved. I think that comes from my training as a street performer. When you're working the street, there's no real way to ignore the fact that you're struggling to do something against the grain. You're working in a place not designed for shows, for people who had not planned on seeing one. Then you have the added complications of drunks, rain and school parties, but if you find a way to make all of those things part of the theatre, then you might be able to cast yourself as the underdog, trying to do something unlikely but laudable. And the people watching, instead of wondering what you think you're doing while giving you the side eye, will want you to succeed. And they'll stick around to see it happen. And suddenly they're not just some people who have gathered in the street around a stranger, they're your audience. Hopefully it won't be too long before we can gather in streets with strangers again. I'll talk to you soon. Matt.
Dear Matt, I'm crazy about the phrase feral Brexiteers, although I'll stipulate that the image is probably a lot less amusing over there right now than it is here. Not that we don't have our own homegrown version. You may have seen some of them on TV in January. Also, side note, feral Brexiteers would be a fantastic name for a speed metal band. But that's not why we're here. We're here to talk about wrestling, apparently? Look, let me make a confession. If you were a mad scientist and you invented a device to gauge people's knowledge of wrestling, just go with me on this, and you tested me with the device, it would light up with 3 big X's, like a slot machine in a cartoon. What I'm saying is, I know virtually nothing about wrestling. I do remember when I was a kid, there were guys named Bruno Sammartino and Gorilla Monsoon, which was the best name ever until feral Brexiteers. And I guess one was a good guy and one was a bad guy, but that's it. So I'm not an expert by any means, but I do agree that wrestling is a good way to think about style. Style, it seems to me, does 2 things simultaneously. The first is, as you say, it reveals the personality of the performer, or the writer, or the wrestler. Maybe I should say it reveals a personality, because in some cases, wrestling for example, the personality on display is largely or entirely made up. It's a creation. The most extreme example of this is Mexican luchadores, who don't just adopt new personas, but literally hide their faces behind masks. This happens in other creative endeavors too. My first book was written in the guise of a fictional advice columnist called Mr. Irresponsible, whose shtick was that people should always indulge their most antisocial impulses, always, as a kind of Darwinian success strategy. It was meant as a satire of self-improvement culture, and I think it was reasonably successful at that, and I hope the 24 people who bought it would agree. Even the Amazon reviewer who called it a thin, tiny book full of thin, tiny advice. I didn't particularly take that harsh criticism personally because it was a satire of an advice book, not an advice book. And anybody who took its advice seriously had to be nuts. And also because I'm not Mr. Irresponsible, any more than Robert James Morella, an Ithaca College graduate and father of 3, was Gorilla Monsoon. Writing as Mr. Irresponsible was a pure exercise in style. Style is the cloak that Morella and you and I, and anybody who creates, puts on. Sometimes that cloak turns you into somebody else entirely. Sometimes it's cut so flatteringly that it makes visible the real you. In either event, it's what makes you stand out in a crowd. Literally so, in your case. There's a second thing style does, and it's the flip side of the coin. Even as it reveals personality, it obscures technique. I think you're in the minority in wanting to show your audience how hard it is, what you do. Generally, people like to say that the great ones make it look easy. What they mean when they say this, I think, is that once somebody's walked that long path of process we talked about in the last episode and has arrived at a place of mastery, style slips into the driver's seat, and command and charisma and all the things that make up style make it hard to see the years of dropping the juggling balls, or of writing lousy prose, or, I guess, of getting thrown through the ropes into the third row. Monsoon wouldn't have been Monsoon if he hadn't first been Morella, a star athlete in high school and college, a guy who ran track and played football, besides wrestling. In 1976, during a TV taping, Monsoon put Muhammad Ali on his shoulders, spun him around, and dropped him on his back. To the end of his life, Monsoon never revealed if the moment was pre-planned or not, but it doesn't matter. He did it. It's a thing you don't do unless you know how. This raises a question. What about style without technique? I suspect you'll agree with me that style without technique is bad. You know that feeling of watching a movie or a TV show or any kind of performance, and sometime in the first minutes, you feel yourself relaxing into it because some ineffable something about it has told you that you're in good hands. I'd argue that what's behind it is a sense that the creator you're watching knows what he's doing, that he has a command of his tools, and that you're going to be treated fairly as a viewer, as a consumer of the entertainment product on offer. There's a transaction of trust between a creator and his audience, and technique is its currency. No amount of empty style can make up for it. If you don't know what you're doing and you try to hide it behind a lot of flashy affectation, you're treating me, your audience, as a mark. I'm wondering what that moment looks like from the performer's point of view. Do you feel it when an audience realizes your style is underpinned by solid technique and they should relax and trust you? It's late afternoon now, and I'm going to call it quits and go walk the dogs. I hope you were able to similarly enjoy your day there in the UK, marauding hordes of feral Brexiteers notwithstanding. Talk to you next time. Bill.
Dear Bill, one does not use wrestling analogies freely unless one is a fan of the thrills, spills and hijinks that occur inside the squared circle. So, as you might have guessed, I am. I have a decent amount of good friends who work in that world, and one of the reasons we've bonded is that we see huge similarities between what they do and what I do. Both traditionally seen as lowbrow, blue-collar art forms, and generally looked down on by those that think of themselves as patrons of the arts. But in both cases, if you take the time to look closely, then you'll see some pretty high-level artistry being employed to get those whoops, cheers and boos. By the way, would you like to know a nice fact about Gorilla Monsoon? After retiring as a wrestler, he had a very successful second career as a wrestling commentator and producer. So beloved was he that the part of the arena that a performer will stand at just before making their grand entrance, what in the theatre would be called the wings, in wrestling, that's called the gorilla position. Backstage at every WWE show, there are signs pointing you to gorilla. I don't know if that Muhammad Ali thing was planned or not, but I'd heavily suspect it was. Ali was a wrestling fan, and he learned how to talk, brag, challenge and hyper-fight from the wrestlers that he came into contact with. In wrestling, that's called cutting a promo. Promo because it's supposed to be promotional, you're talking to sell tickets. Lucha masks hide identity, sure, but they also make the wearer feel more powerful, covered with designs and iconography that comes from lineage, family, history and faith. I know how that feels. However I'm feeling in my real life, putting on a good suit for a show, paying tribute to the gentlemen jugglers of 100 years ago who are my heroes, makes me feel bulletproof. I'd agree with you that style without technique is bad. I'd go further, it's arrogant. It tells me that I'm seeing someone doing whatever they're doing for perhaps the wrong reason. They want the juice without the squeeze, to call back to a previous episode. There's nothing worse than feeling, as an audience member, that you're not in safe hands. It's at best disappointing, and at worst downright scary. I guess I'm lucky, having started out on the street where gaining the trust of strangers is pretty much the first thing you have to learn. Nobody's going to stop and watch you if all they see is a weirdo shouting in the middle of a street. And that's a tricky puzzle to solve, since that's basically completely what you are. You have to develop a set of tricks and skills and tells that communicate to someone whose attention you've caught for a second that you know what you're doing, that you know what it looks like, but that they should trust you. And that's not the easiest thing to pull off, but if you can do it outside on a drizzly Tuesday in London, then doing it anywhere else shouldn't be too much of a problem. I guess I'm touching on one of the most important skills any creative can develop, to see yourself and your work as others see it. If you have an idea about your audience's assumptions about you and what you make, then you can satisfy or confound them more effectively. If you're too busy being inside your house to ever go outside, turn around and look at it, then you'll never really know where you live. Well, to paraphrase the great Gorilla Monsoon, I don't get paid by the hour, bub. So I'll talk to you soon. Matt.
Dear Matt, I agree that it's useful to have a good bead on what your audience's assumptions are about what they're about to see or read, and about you as the person who's bringing it to them. As an example, I've thought often over the years about how that telethon story has stuck in readers' minds, and why it has. To a large degree, I think, it's because it was so extremely unusual a thing to read in a news magazine in 1987. I'm not saying it was the best Newsweek story ever, and honest people can disagree about whether or not the jokes worked, although the thing about a troupe of acrobatic Newfoundlands is still a hill I'm willing to die on. The point is, context is everything. It wasn't so much the style that made it pop, as that it was all style, in a publication that had, for the previous 50 years, run as far and as fast from individual authorial voices as it could. I mentioned earlier that notion of a magisterial house style. Success at Newsweek in those days meant mastering it, mastering all its arcane elements. The violin, the billboard, the arrows to Toyland. For those of you keeping score at home, these were, respectively, the opening paragraph, the paragraph that followed, and the signposts you placed thereafter to point your story toward its conclusion. The road to success did not run through subverting the form, however fun the subversion might have been. And I'm not going to lie, it was fun. Probably too much fun. After flying back to New York and crashing for 24 solid hours, I delivered to my editor a story that overran its allotted space by about 200%. This was very unusual for me. Like the pro that I was, I prided myself on delivering copy that was close to space. In this case, I succumbed to the sugar high and let it rip. There's a famous cartoon by Jack Ziegler, the great New Yorker cartoonist, called Hamburger Madness. It pictures a guy in an apron standing in front of a backyard grill, piles of cooked hamburgers towering over his head as the sun peeks over the horizon, and with an insane gleam in his eye, he's saying to his exasperated wife, "Sun up? Already?" That was me writing the telethon story. "I get it," my editor told me. "I see what you're doing. You're trying to get me to kill this thing so you can sell it to Rolling Stone." To her credit, she didn't kill it, but she did take a scalpel to it. Subversion has its limits. That's what differentiates it from anarchy. And by definition, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. You can't push back on the walls around you unless there are walls. It's worth saying again, I wouldn't have gotten that chance to undermine the form if I hadn't shown that I understood it. I stretched the rubber band farther than anybody reasonably thought it could be stretched, and that was style. But I also knew exactly how far to stretch it without breaking it. That was technique. I hope, like Gorilla Monsoon putting Ali in an airplane spin, you're exuberantly but exactingly practicing your trade in the UK today. Stay safe, as always, and stay off the canvas. Bill. Imagination and Junk is written by Bill Barol in the U.S., and Mat Ricardo in the UK, with audio production by Bill Barol. For more information, show notes, and bonus content, it's imaginationandjunk.com.